Let's talk about, before going back into the YouTube chat, let's talk about Jupiter's Legacy. So Jupiter's Legacy is a Netflix series, and it is created by Stephen S. DeKnight. Now, as I was watching these first 6 episodes, I actually didn't know who Stephen S. DeKnight was. I had no idea his history or his pedigree, but having looked him up, I can understand now why there's a lot of things that I do like about Jupiter's Legacy. For one, he's, of course, the producer, executive producer. He's again, the creator of the series itself, but also he had a major hand in the Daredevil show. So the Netflix Daredevil series, which was spectacular. He was also involved in Spartacus, which I've heard really good things about as well. He also was a part of Dollhouse, which was a Joss Whedon production, which, despite people's thoughts about Joss Whedon, again, I can separate art from the artist and a lot of things. Dollhouse, for me, I really like Dollhouse. I think that some could probably find an argument to be made about some messaging and things like that, but personally, I actually really liked the storyline of Dollhouse. I thought it was very creative, and just like a lot of other Joss Whedon shows, didn't have a very long life. It got only 2 seasons or so. So the fact that he was involved with that, it says here he was listed as a consulting producer, and he also wrote one of the episodes, was pretty cool. He was involved with Smallville, he was involved with Angel, and he was involved with Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So this guy has a really good pedigree of shows. Like, all of those are, of the ones that I've seen, they're all solid. And of the ones I haven't, I've heard solid things about them. So that, I think, explains why there are a lot of things that I do like about the show. That being said, there are also a couple things I don't like. And one of the biggest, of course, this is something that I've mentioned on the channel several times before. I just hate how Netflix, HBO, any of these streaming services, I hate how a lot of them just feel this need to throw in things that are really unnecessary. When they throw in, random language, for instance. Again, it doesn't bother me as much as some other things, but there's times when you're like, is that really the most clever thing you could have written? Like, to me, you start to add in those types of things because your writing is not clever enough to be able to exist without them. It's interesting because I was listening to a podcast the other day, and I think they made a very interesting point. Everyone always, I think, when they look back at 40s and 50s era Hollywood, they always talk about how the code was such a restrictive measure, right? The code that existed that restricted freedom and freedom of expression in filmmaking. And I do think there's truth to that, right? Because there were limitations. And yet, when you were to ask, and if you are to ask most people what the best decades of film were, or what the best movies ever made were, isn't it interesting that almost universally they come from that same era? And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that these creators, these writers, and these directors at that time in history were essentially forced to be more creative. It meant that they had to be able to create something that was smart, that was able to, of course, fit into this certain criteria, this certain code, but still also be good. And it meant that they couldn't rely on sex. They couldn't rely on drugs. They couldn't rely on foul language to try and bring people in, like a lot of other movies and shows tend to do. Right? That was one of the biggest problems with Game of Thrones, is that Game of Thrones had such a great, rich story, and yet you got so distracted because of all of the excess nudity and sex, which was unnecessary. It honestly was unnecessary. That the show would have been better had that stuff not been there, had they focused instead on the writing and on the story. And of course, that goes to the novels as well. But again, that's a whole tangent there. But in this show, it falls into some of those traps, though I am glad to say that it's not pervasive. There really isn't much nudity to be had, but there are a few so far in the episodes that I have seen, the first 6 episodes. There are a couple of sexual sequences, which, again, I don't think serve much of a purpose. I don't think that they add really to anything to the show. And so, again, that's one of the gripes that I have, is that it once again adds itself to another one of those shows that just has to rely on that, even if it is very minimal, which thank God it is very minimal. It's still there nonetheless, but it is interesting. So just as the basic synopsis given here on IMDb, it says the first generation of superheroes has kept the world safe for nearly a century. Now their children must live up to their legacy in an epic drama that spans decades and navigates the dynamics of family, power, and loyalty. And that spanning of decades is, I think, also where there starts to come some tension and some issues with the story that I have, because the entire show, every episode, you're jumping back and forth between the present time and back in like the 1920s during the era of the stock market crash. So like you're going back to the late 1920s, early 1930s. So you're going back and forth every single episode. It happens at times rather sporadically, because they are very clever in that they do change the aspect ratio. So whenever they're in the present, the black bars like come in from the top and bottom and tells you that you're in a different time. Whereas when it goes back in time, it actually will expand out, but it's still in color. The production value is still essentially the same. They don't change anything with like film quality. Like there's some things they could have done that I think could have actually had those transitions work a little bit better. But even that wasn't really an issue. The issue to me was just that there are times when the story goes back and forth where it feels like they have these two stories. They have the origin of how they became superheroes, right? Because that's what's happening back in the past. So they have this story of how they became superheroes, and then they have, of course, what's happening now in real life. And so it looks like what they said was, ooh, this could be clever. Let's just have it where it goes back and forth. That way we can tell both stories and they'll kind of be connected in a certain way. But I just haven't really gotten the feeling. There's some shows and movies that do the jumping in time well, where things really correlate, like depending on what's happening in the present to what's happening in the past. Whereas with this show, it just feels like they go back in the past because they have to, because they want to tell the audience what the origin point is. They want to tell the origin story, but they also want to show the heroes acting in real life and the issues and struggles that they're going through. And there hasn't really been a lot of connections, at least from what I've been able to see, between the two. It seems a little bit more random in the jumping back and forth. So I think that if you look at both individually, I think they're both pretty good. There's obviously heroes with powers. The powers are interesting. The costume design, I think, is actually pretty good as well, because it definitely lies into them being actual superheroes, right? So actually wearing capes, actually wearing, the spandex and everything. You have really good heroes. You have super villains. You have all of these different categories, and I think it's really cool to see all of those play out. But yeah, I think my biggest issue so far is probably in the story elements not always really matching up, because again, individually, I think that they're pretty well done. They're pretty well written. It's in the fact that they're trying to tie them both together, going back and forth. I don't think it works as seamlessly as they may have planned it to. And in the end, it seems almost like it's, oh yeah, we have to go back to the past because we haven't finished the origin story yet. So let's go back a little further into the origin story instead of it connecting to what you're seeing happen in real life. I don't know. That's just what I've been getting from it in general. But those are my initial thoughts on Jupiter's Legacy. So again, I have a couple episodes left still, and it's not a bad show. It's not a show that I dislike. I don't think there's a whole lot of wokeness in the show. I'm sure that there are people who've been able to point out some elements of it, but I really haven't seen it. It's not as really as pervasive as other shows that we have seen, because when they do go back in time, some of the characters who are in the show, who are African-American, obviously are dealing with a different time. And so to me, that's appropriate, because you're in the 1920s now, and this is what it would have been like for African-Americans at this time. But also, it's not a central point. It's just a part of the general narrative. And again, it makes sense to me and it works. So I think that some people might construe that or say that that's a place that one could look to find wokeness. I don't think, though, that there is, because again, it fits very well with the time period that they're in. And if things work and make sense historically, then I typically will not harp on that. But anyway, let me know your thoughts if you have seen Jupiter's Legacy, and what your thoughts are on the show itself. And now for a huge shout out to all of my Patreon and Subscribestar members for the month of May: Ali C83, Andrew Hoyle, Biffer the Hobbit, Brian P, Dion, Divex, Enrique Evangelista, Father Christopher Miller, hail to you, Father. Father Damian Cook, Garrett Searles, Inflamed Wood, It's a Trap Productions, Jason Clark, Jacob Juice, Jeffrey Toone, Jonathan Carney, Laura the Modern Major General's Story, Mad Mitch Dunaway, Mike Jackson, Mr. Peabody and his evil twin with the beautiful hair, On to June, Orange Chat Reviews, Out of Step with Reality, Priscilla Hall, Riff Magos, Rosetta Odin, Steve Glasker, Miss Martin Muses, Theodore Bendon, Tina Bojan, and Tina B. Thank you all very much for being my Patreon members this month. I really always appreciate you. And to my Subscribe Star members, Fast Reaction, Nosferatu Gatsu, Stand For, John B., Perpetual Punster, Mr. Roy, Glinzer, J. Alex McCarthy Jr., Dean Heiss, the new number 2, J-Rod, the Beer Guru, Nevadanji Adams, and ZK-Man. Thank you very much for supporting me on Subscribestar, and if you want your name shouted out at the end of every video and live stream, please consider joining on Patreon or Subscribestar. And if you join at some of the higher levels, you get access to things like giveaways, where every month I do giveaways of 4K titles, steelbooks, and Blu-rays. And again, more information can be found over on Patreon and Subscribestar. And at the higher levels, you also get access to an exclusive bi-monthly podcast, depending on our schedules. We at least get one long podcast out. We try and get 2 podcasts out as often as we possibly can every single month with John the Flick Pick Flickinger. So again, check out more information. And if you are at the Chosen of Valhalla level, which is the highest level available, you not only get all of those things, you also get in your first month a free t-shirt and also access to the Chosen of Valhalla live stream, where I have my Chosen on a stream talking, asking questions, answering questions, talking about movies and anything that they want to talk about. So if all that stuff sounds like fun to you, check out those links below and support the channel in whatever way you can. I do appreciate you, whether you are a member, whether you are a supporter on Patreon, Subscribestar, or whether you are simply supportive in general, leaving comments and likes. I really greatly appreciate it. You guys are all amazing, beautiful people. Have a wonderful day. And as always, God bless.